We are going to make two meals for dinner tonight, a chicken pot pie and what basically turned out to be a cottage pie. So I use my freeze-dried milk. I've shared this several times. Whenever I need milk for a recipe, especially if it's a cup or under a cup, I will use my freeze-dried milk. It saves money on using the drinking milk that is typically gone within a couple days of getting. My nephew's definitely a milk drinker, and so I save money by using my freeze-dried milk. I'm going to get that mixed together and I'll set it aside for a couple minutes just to make sure everything does in fact get hydrated. I am making a biscuit dough here because I'm going to put biscuits underneath the cottage pie and on top, and I'm going to put biscuits on top of my chicken pot pie. I'm using lard because I have so much of it. We rendered that lard together. I've actually never made biscuits using lard before, but I've heard over and over and over on how delicious your biscuits come out with using lard. And I will have to say, I do agree. There's probably one recipe where I would continue to use the butter just because I want to make sure it stays on the sweeter side and not for this particular meal a savory type of dish. But all in all, you really can't hardly tell that I used lard flavor wise in place of butter. So if you have lard, absolutely recommend using it. I'm just going to get that incorporated with my flour. I don't hardly measure a lot when I'm cooking. I'll measure my dry ingredients, the flour, baking soda, or I'm sorry, baking powder and salt there in the dish. And of course, I had to measure out my milk just simply because I had to make sure I rehydrated it properly. But with the lard, I just put it in there as to how I see fit. So, but I will have a recipe for my biscuit dough down below. I'm going to get that incorporated and set aside. And then I want you to listen to the 2 jars of chicken that I opened because I ended up tossing my first jar, and I will explain why when you hear what they sound like. Getting the casserole dishes oiled first so that nothing sticks, of course. The first jar did make a ping sound. That lid button top definitely pinged when it opened, but I did not hear much of a vacuum being released. And when I lifted that lid, it kind of felt as though it was just being lifted up. Where that second jar, if you go back and listen, you can hear that vacuum being released. That is what you want. It isn't always so much that your button top has pinged when you opened it. That does happen quite often, but you want to hear the vacuum being released. And so I always err on the side of caution and decided to dump that last jar and just went and got a new jar. It isn't worth risking whether or not it is in fact a good sealed jar. I will cut my loss over being sick or my family being sick. So when I drained the chicken into the bowl, I of course picked apart all of the chicken pieces, and I should have just drained the broth into my pot ahead of time. I don't know what I was thinking, but basically you're just going to get the chicken and broth together in a pot. I threw in my vegetables. I was thinking I would share one can between both dishes and ultimately decided it just didn't look like enough for my pot pie. So I used the whole can and went and grabbed another mixed vegetable can for the cottage pie. I'm going to get that incorporated together with some spices and seasonings, and we're going to get it on the stovetop with some flour, and I do add some additional chicken broth as well. And then we basically just want to get that all thickened together. However you decide to go about getting to that point of your pot pie, go right ahead. This is my secret ingredient, by the way. I add this in my chicken pot pies all of the time. I don't know why, but it just lends an amazing flavor. And it's really the only reason I have it, so it lasts me quite a while. I don't use it to make actual country gravy. I would just make that homemade, but I always add a couple tablespoons of it into my pot pie, and let me tell you, it is fantastic. I really, really recommend it. And, yeah, so and then if you wanna use cream of something soups, go right ahead. I tend to just add flour and let it slowly thicken and come together. So this all in all, throwing this pot pie together probably took me a matter of 10 minutes, and then it just needed to simmer on the stove for somewhere between 5 and 10 while I got started on the other dish that I was making that night, which is the ground hamburger meat that we canned together. This does have the water in it that we canned, and then I do believe we added a little bit of the Knorr beef stock as well, the powdered. And we are going to put the beef and liquid in the pot. We're not going to drain it because we are adding some flour, basically same thing as the pot pie. We just want to get it mixed up. And I'm sorry, we want to get it thickened up. Add in whatever spices you think your family would enjoy. I did some Italian seasoning, garlic powder, onion powder, salt, and pepper. I tend to keep things more on the basic side when it comes to my nephew having to eat whatever it is we're making. He is incredibly picky, definitely doesn't like overpowered, flavored, heavy on the spice type of dishes. So I kept it pretty basic. I also added some freeze dried peas to my chicken pot pie because when I was looking at the vegetables that came in my mixed vegetable dish, it was incredibly heavy on the carrot side. And I felt like there was hardly any other vegetables in there. And that's the great thing about having freeze dried vegetables is you can just take a handful. They hydrate really quickly compared to dehydrated vegetables. So I can just throw them into anything that I'm making as long as I know it has at least 20 minutes or so to hydrate within the cooking process. And generally, I don't have any issues with them not coming out, you know, hydrated and edible. I'm lining my casserole dish with my biscuits. I will say, if you do this, I don't know what I was thinking, but the second I poured my beef mixture over the top, I was like, oh, I really wanted to give my biscuits a head start in the oven just to make sure that they were fully cooked because this is somewhat of a quick recipe. We're really putting it into the oven, allowing enough time for the cheese to melt and that top biscuit to cook, which is every bit of only 20 minutes. And I forgot. So I do recommend doing that. It ended up turning out okay because I put the lid on and allowed that biscuit to cook a little bit more slower. So it turned out okay, but next time I will certainly throw it in the oven to give a head start on the biscuits. With my chicken pot pie, of course, you can do it however you wish, but I opted to only put a biscuit on top of the chicken pot pie rather than one on the bottom and one on the top. My husband and I both just prefer it that way. I will say these ramekin dishes are just amazing. They are perfect for individual sized portions of something like this. But also, if I wanted to, I would make some mashed potatoes and top everything with mashed potatoes instead of biscuits, like I said earlier. I almost always make my pot pie that way, but today I didn't feel like fussing with it and just chose to do biscuits. When I do this again, I will either double my biscuit recipe or I will only put the biscuits on top because when I ended up topping the cottage pie, I was a bit short, but that's okay. It turned out good. I mean, it really doesn't make any difference at the end of the day. But this turned out so, so delicious. You could substitute chicken in your pot pie for turkey. I do that a lot. I only can turkey one time a year, and I generally use it for pot pies only. So I do really recommend doing that. But this is a example of how to use your canned meat, but also how you can just quickly get dinner on the table because your meat is already cooked for you. You didn't have to go and add in the step of cooking any of the meat ahead of time. really saving quite a bit of time for your meal. I started cooking this around 5:30, and I believe we ended up eating somewhere between 6:30 and 7 because I allowed everything to rest for a little while. So, I hope this helps you and encourages you to get some meat on your pantry shelf. Thank you for watching, and I'll meet you back here in the kitchen to cook up something for my family. Take care.